Greetings, this is Ted A. Roberts with Seeking the Everlasting Gospel Ministries, and today we are actually starting on chapter 3 of my book, Surprising Dismissal of Water Baptism and the Communion, Carnal Ordinances, Part 2, the Naturalistic World that had come to an end. And I want to start off by saying thank you to all of you guys that's been staying with me through these video series. And I hope that you continue to watch these. I hope they continue to bless you. So having said that, let's go ahead and get started. Again, this is chapter 3, and this chapter is called the Transitional Overlapping Period. And I'll explain, of course, what that means during this chapter. Now, as I've said before, Jesus, in a symbolic manner, actually nailed all the ordinances, that is, ritualistic practices of the flesh, of the Old Testament onto his cross, which we saw in Colossians 2:14, showing us that that all of them had come to a close. But did that include water baptism and the communion? That is, the two main ordinances of the New Testament church. Again, water baptism and even the communion were established before the New Testament had even begun, like I had talked about in previous chapters, the previous 2 chapters of this book. That is, if we understand that the New Testament had actually began after Jesus had died on the cross, again in Hebrews 9:17. But one can certainly argue, however, that it was only because Jesus was establishing them as a New Testament ordinance or New Testament ordinances before he died on the cross. But still, we have to contend with the fact that Paul, not too long afterwards, actually stopped baptizing people with natural water, and was even thankful that he did, as I had actually went over in chapter 1 of this present book. And then, as we'll see very soon, he actually gave a time limit to the use of the communion. And that's coming up. Which time limit, as we're going to see, this is going to be a few chapters from now actually, didn't even reach past AD 70. Yes, what I'm ultimately saying here is that all the ordinances which are performed outwardly with the flesh were completely done away with by AD 70, falling along with that old Jerusalem temple, of which temple was designed to house outward fleshly rituals, and leaving all the ordinances now as to being done spiritually rather than naturally. So having said that, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. And it says, and this is Paul talking, "Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and that you keep the ordinances as I deliver them to you." And that is spiritually this time, which can now be performed inwardly rather than outwardly and naturally, of that which has to be performed on the outside and with the natural body. That's outward carnal worship. For we should compare that thought of Paul's to Moses' Old Testament assignment. As we see in Exodus 18:20, this is God talking to Moses. "You shall teach them ordinances and laws." See, not just the old law itself, but also all the rituals that went along with that old law. "And you shall show them the way wherein they must walk, and all the work that they must do." As I've just got through saying, all the ordinances, even if folks were still doing them up until AD 70, which they were, finally fell with the temple in that same year, as it literally toppled to the ground by the armies of Rome, who had besieged it and the city of Jerusalem beginning just a couple of years prior, in and about AD 66. Indeed, they besieged Jerusalem until the temple itself had come crushing down to the ground, in which act God had said to the entire world that he no longer dwells in temples made with man's hands, of which Stephen had spoke about, and of which Jesus actually prophesied about. So let's go to Acts chapter 7, verse 48a, But you can also see this in Acts 17:24, which I believe Paul was talking about as well. Howbeit, the Most High dwells not in temples made with hands, that is, man's hands. Now let's go to Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2. Now Jesus went out, and he departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple, but not the courtyard, nor the surrounding walls, but just the buildings of the temple itself. Jesus said to them, Do you not see all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now for the fulfillment of that, we go to the Wars of the Jews, written in AD 75 by Flavius Josephus. This is going to be Book 7, Chapter 8, Verse 7. And you can also find this at sacredtext.com. Where is the city? Where is the city, Jerusalem, that was believed to have God himself inhabiting therein? It is now demolished to the very foundations, and has nothing but that monument of it preserved. I mean the camp of those who had destroyed it, which still dwells upon its ruins, i.e. the western or the Wailing Wall, which still stands today. Some unfortunate old men also lie upon the ashes of the temple. A few women are there preserved alive by the enemy for our bitter shame and reproach. Now who is there that revolves these things in their minds, and yet is able to bear the sight of the sun, though he might live out of danger? Who is there so much his country's enemy, or so unmanly, or so desirous of living, as to not repent that he's still alive? And I cannot but wish that we all had died before we had seen that holy city demolished by the hands of our enemies, or the foundations of our holy temple dug up after so profane a manner. See, there's your eyewitness. All of which, again, came to pass in AD 70, when the walls of that temple literally and actually came crashing down. So not only did all the ordinances cease, of which Daniel spoke about. Now let's go to Daniel 9:26 through 27, and I do have a very important explanatory note on that in just a moment for these verses. This is what Daniel says. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off. That's Jesus dying on the cross, but not for himself. See, it was for the sins of the people. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city, Jerusalem, and the sanctuary, the temple, that is, Caesar Nero sent in his Roman army to destroy them in approximately AD 66, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. Again, the flooding of the Roman army pouring into the city of Jerusalem, for waters metaphorically at times represent people. See, for instance, Revelation 17:15, Isaiah 17:12 through 13a, and Isaiah 57, verse 20. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. This is Daniel's 70th week. And in the midst of that week, right in the middle of that week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. That is, all the ordinances are going to come to an end when that temple falls. As again, we're going to talk about in the explanatory note coming up. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Again, we're going to go over this in an explanatory note in just 1 minute. But so did also all the ordinances that were established during the Old Testament times, of which we are particularly speaking of during the course of this book. All of which, once more, were done away with by his dying on the cross, being established by a second witness, the tearing down of the temple, the house where fleshly outward ordinances were established and performed for so many years.